Thanks be to God.
The sermon will be given by Chaplain Densford, the Deputy Garrison Chaplain.
It is my pleasure to be with you today, to worship with you. And it's always a joy to come and worship with the other Christian communities on post, so it's my pleasure to be here. Well, as we look at this passage, the gospel reading this morning, I'm going to take off from that, and we see from this passage that it was the third resurrection appearance of Jesus, that he had made himself known to the disciples, and now this third time. And the last gospel, or at least depending on which lectionary you're following, not sure here, but the last appearance that he had with them, he reminded them that they were to go, that they were to continue the mission that Jesus had begun. He had continually been telling them that they would go, that they would continue on serving God the Father as he had been doing. So Jesus had just sent them to go, and here they were out fishing again. They returned to what they had done before. Now, granted, it could be they were just hungry. It could be they just needed fish. They needed something to eat. But they went fishing, and we find them in this passage instead of doing what Jesus had called them to do. But we see in this, and I'm going to, just like a good sermon, I've got 3 points, but I've got 3 observations and 3 lessons I want to look at today. As we see first in this passage that on their own they caught nothing. How many times do we attempt to do things on our own? Whether it's as part of the church or our own careers or in our families, we try to do things on our own strength or in our own power, in our own wisdom, and we just fail. Now, the disciples were here in this situation, and they went out to do this fishing instead of doing what Jesus had sent them to do, and they failed. On their own, they caught nothing. But then we see quickly that obeying Jesus, that they were overwhelmed. They were overwhelmed in a couple different ways. First, with the catch, they recognized that it was Jesus when suddenly, they were fishing, and then they did what Jesus said and cast the net on the other side, and they had the catch that they did. So they were overwhelmed with that. But also the nets didn't break. This load that they had, normal nets wouldn't have held that load. So the nets didn't break. And again, they recognized that it was God's doing. It includes all of these things. And it even mentions the number of the 153 fish. Now, I don't think the writer counted them, and they knew that there was 103 exactly fish there. And this comes from several different places, or scholars have debated about where this 153 comes from, and I find it a bit interesting. One of the ideas, Cyril of Alexandria, he added this up. He said, well, 100 recognizes or represents the fullness of the Gentiles. 50 represents the remnant of Israel. 3 is the Holy Trinity. So there's your 153. St. Augustine, he adds it up differently. He says, well, 10 represents the law. 7 represents grace. Well, 1 through 17 added up equals 153. And Augustine says this signifies all who are included in the saving operation of grace. Well, the Greeks, they just take a simple approach, and they just had identified that there were 153 different types of fish. So they would say that in mentioning there were 153, that it showed the completeness of God's miracle. That they just didn't catch a few fish. They just didn't get a couple trout, maybe a salmon, and whatever might be. Those probably wouldn't be on that lake, but whatever that might be in that lake. But it shows the completeness of the miracle that Jesus provided for them. So we see that on their own they caught nothing, but obeying Jesus, they were overwhelmed. But then if we were to go on, and I'm not going to jump too far into this, but if we were to keep reading in 15, Jesus sends them again. So when Jesus ascended, he said, go. When he saw them again in the upper room where they were locked in, he said, continue on this mission that I sent you on. And here again, this third post-resurrection appearance, he sends them again. And of course, there's that famous interaction with Peter and the feeding the sheep and the lamb. But we're not going to get into that as much. As we look at this experience, though, this event, this happening, this encounter with Jesus, we see first that the disciples experience a need. Now, it could have been that need was just hunger. Though it could have been that they needed to be where they were comfortable. That they had just experienced, that they had followed Jesus for 3 years. They had gone through his ups and downs. Then they had experienced this trial and his crucifixion. And then they were up again when they saw him resurrected, risen from the dead. It could be that they just needed something comfortable, something familiar. So they went back to that profession that they had understood before Jesus called them. But whatever the reason is, and the scripture is not clear on that, we see that they experienced a need. Second, we see that the disciples couldn't meet that need on their own. We see that they caught nothing. They went out, they fished evidently all night, and they caught nothing. And that's unusual. These were professional fishermen. These weren't just somebody, I wouldn't be surprised if I went fishing and caught nothing. I'm not a fisherman. These guys were professional fishermen. They went out and went fishing with the proper equipment. They caught nothing. So on their own, they weren't able to meet that need. Just like I had said earlier, when we try to do things on our own, so often we're just not able to measure up. We're not able to do what God would want us to do. But third, we see that the disciples' need was met by Jesus. They caught a lot. But more than that, and I'm assuming here that their need probably was the hunger, because they get to shore and Jesus had breakfast ready. That he was there to provide their need. So he, I think, sees this as a surface level, and he sees it deeper. And God does that for us as well. The disciples probably felt like they were doing something, well, we just need to go fishing, we need fish. But more likely it was a deeper psychological thing. They needed that comfortableness, that familiarness. So Jesus gave them what they needed deep, that familiar feeling, and they let him, or he provided for them this great catch of fish so they could feel that familiar again. But then when they got to shore, he provided that surface need as well. And he fed them. He had the fish on the fire ready to go. So the disciples' need was met by Jesus. So how do we experience God's help? And I'm preaching to the choir, I get that. But it's good for me oftentimes to go back to Scripture and be reminded, how can I apply this to me? How can I allow this Scripture to speak to me? How can it help me? So how can we experience God's help? And I would be the first to raise my hand and say, I constantly need God's help. When I go out on my own, I fail. When I try to be the husband and father I'm supposed to be without considering God or Scripture, I fail. When I try to do my job or make the plans on my own, I fail. But when God's involved, we succeed. So how do we experience God's help? Well, first, let's follow the disciples' example here. We admit that we have a need. We admit our need. And they said, Jesus called out to them, hey, did you catch anything? They said no. Essentially, they were admitting their need. If they were relying on themselves or if they were where they were 3 years before, they would have said, don't worry, Jesus, we got it. We're professional fishermen. We're just going to keep working at this. We know what to do. But they answered his question honestly. They admitted their need. When Jesus said, got anything? They said no. So we need to admit our need. When we realize we're over our head, when we realize we can't do it on our own, when we realize we need God's help, we need to admit that need. Secondly, we need to accept his help. That just in answering the question, they were acknowledging that they had failed. They were acknowledging the fact that they needed something beyond themselves. So we need, in the same way, accept his help. Third, we need to obey his command. After they admitted the need, after they accepted his help by engaging with them, he said, put the net on the other side. Now, they could have easily again said, hey, we're pros at this. We're professional fishermen. We know what we're doing. But they accepted the help that Jesus had to offer. They cast the net on the other side. And then their nets were full. They received what they needed. Finally, after we have received his need, we need to acknowledge his help. John was the first one to say it. As soon as that net was full, he recognized, he said, that it is the Lord. He recognized him as Jesus because he saw God's hand in this miracle, in that catch of fish. In the same way, we need to acknowledge his help. When God works in our life, when God helps us through our situation, when he delivers us, from those problems, we need to acknowledge that he has helped us. And that does two things at least. One, it increases our faith because we acknowledge it is God who is our help. But also it helps to build the kingdom and spread the good news because others see that God has done that work in our lives. So I encourage us today as we journey from, through Easter to Pentecost, that we think on these things, that we consider the example of the disciples, that when we have those needs that we face, which again in my life is every day, that we acknowledge him as our help, that we admit our need, that we accept that help, and that we obey his command.